And let's see. I'm looking to our team here right now. And here is Douglas Thomas. I'm so excited to see you, Douglas. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. Not too bad. Not too bad. Never clear. It's never clear.
It's never clear. Well, so Douglas, I wanted to, very quickly, tell everyone who you are. Associate Professor of Annenberg School for Communication at USC. You're so Professor at USC Iovine. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Iveen. Yeah. Yeah.
Ivine, sorry,
Iveen and
Ivy
Young. Yeah.
and Young Academy. You're researching the intersection of technology and culture. Also founded Games and Culture, the first academic journal studying video game culture, and collaborated with John Seeley Brown um, to develop Gamer Disposition, named a Harvard Business Review Breakthrough Ideas. So your book, A New Culture of Learning, is read worldwide, and you also consult with governments on educational reform, and you're currently working on bodies of code. And today we are going to dive into um, how we're moving towards a compassionate AI. So, Douglas,
Or at least hopefully.
walk us
Well,
through this.
yeah, I've got some slides to share. So it just so happens that this semester I'm teaching one class called Understanding AI. And the other class I'm teaching is on the history of Japanese animation. So this presentation marries those two interests, talking a little bit about AI, but also about some of the lessons learned from Miyazaki Hayao film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Uh,
Hmm.
and let me just go ahead and uh, share some slides. Hopefully everybody can see those okay.
Okay.
And I really am excited about this because, Miyazaki does such a wonderful job of talking about issues of nature, of technology, of identity. And I think some of the things that he talks about in this film bear directly on some of the issues that we're facing today and some of the crises that we may be dealing with in the future. So what I wanted to do was just go through some of the key points of the film, assuming not everybody has seen it, or if they've seen it, it's long enough ago that they might not remember it so well. Suppose it'd be a little bit different if I was giving this presentation in Osaka, but uh, I'll start off just by introducing kind of what I mean by AI. And there's a lot of ways that we can look at this, and I've sort of made a study of it going back to Alan Turing and his journal paper, as well as the Dartmouth Conference in 1956. And I feel like there's really four stages to think about. The first being symbolic AI, which is really rule governed, and which really started at that Dartmouth conference and led into John McCarthy developing a programming language like Lisp. Against that was sort of pitted the idea of neural nets. That is, how can we make computers act like brains, firing neurons? And the idea behind this is that you have these layers where they function like little neurons firing, and then you weight them and you change those weights and transform them until it gets to the answer that you want. Uh, that led to large language models, which really combine some of the symbolic, but mostly using huge amounts of data in order to train these models. And now we're up to billions of parameters in order to make predictive guesses about what comes next, which is what we're seeing with ChatGPT and Claude and these other models. And then the final stage that I want to spend some time talking about is what comes next, which is artificial general intelligence, AGI, and the promise or threat, depending on how you look at it, of something like super intelligence. And the illustration for this, again, is Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, a film that really does talk about a lot of these issues, however, in a different context. Miyazaki's interest in this film circulates around nuclear war, nuclear winter, and the crises we are facing in the early 80s. rather than what we're facing today. But I think there's a lot of lessons we can pull from it. So the story starts 1,000 years ago with the great warriors. There's actually five of them that represented the nuclear powers at the time. 7 days of fire, big nuclear conflagration, and really destroys the earth, leaving behind this, which is the toxic jungle. The toxic jungle is filled with incredible insects and colors, but primarily toxic spores. So it literally is a place where you can't breathe if you're a human being. But there are animals, there are insects, and there are creatures called omu who are almost prehistoric looking guardians of the jungle and the forest. Apart from where Nausicaa is, there's also two countries of Tolmekia and Pichite who are at war with each other. And they're at war with each other because the toxic jungle is ever encroaching on their territory, which means they have less and less space. They're engaging in rapid industrialization. Resources are scarce. So they're in a constant state of war with Tolmekia almost completely committing genocide against the people of Pichite. Contrasted with that is the Valley of the Wind, which is a beautiful, pastoral, wonderful area, which is an ecotone between the sea and the land. And as you can see, it's powered by the wind. So, in counterpoint to the industrialization of these other countries, it is passive, it exists in harmony with nature, it embraces nature, and the wind of the valley keeps the toxic spores from encroaching in their space. So, it's this nice kind of settlement that's able to live in balance. The Princess of the Valley of the Wind is Nausicaa, who is our main character, and she's contrasted with Kushana. Kushana is the leader of Tolmekia, and you can see a little bit here. She's been ravaged by some of the insects. A lot of her body's been replaced by machinery. She really does represent a kind of technological vision of the future. So she brings with her a giant warrior, one of the leftover warriors from 1,000 years ago, but it's still kind of cooking. It's not quite fully developed. She brings it to the valley in order to take over and control, and in her mind, hopefully protect people from the encroaching toxic jungle and the insects. At the same time, Nausicaa is something of a scientist, and what she's been doing is going into the toxic jungle and exploring it like a scientist and trying to understand what exactly is happening. And the discovery that she makes is that the toxic jungle is actually purifying the land. It's not a threat, but it's a filtering system. And below the toxic jungle is this vast network of purified fresh water and cleansed resources. So the valley is invaded by Kushana and the Tolmekians. There's a big battle, and Nausicaa gives in as princess after her father is killed and allows them to occupy the land. Pichite decides to get revenge, and they find a baby Omu, uh, and they torture it in order to get all the Omu from the toxic jungle excited and create a stampede into the Valley of the Wind, which looks something like that. Their eyes go from blue to red. They're in blind rage, and they're going to trample all of the Valley of the Wind, kill everyone. Uh, Lucky for Kushana, she has her giant warrior, so she basically uses a nuclear detonation to try to wipe them out. However, it fails. And in the process, the giant warrior melts down, which kind of is a nice allegory for literally a nuclear meltdown. Um, the the raging stampede is ended when Nausicaa decides to sacrifice herself, and with the baby Umu that she saved, she stands in the way of the stampeding Omu, and they trample her, and she dies. But because she's able to have this compassion and understanding, they recognize her sacrifice and they resurrect her on a field of gold, which kind of fulfills a prophecy of becoming of a prophet in a blue outfit who will unite the world. And that's sort of where it ends. We have a somewhat hopeful message. The last shot of the film is her cap, along with what looks like fresh growth and rejuvenation. So that's just kind of quick gloss on some of the highlights and key points. So what are the lessons that we've learned? I think there's four takeaways to this film: harmony, ethics, fear, and understanding. And I want to talk about each of those in turn, both as they relate to the film, but more importantly, how they relate to AI and this idea of building a compassionate AI. So harmony is really represented by this beautiful vision of the earth below the toxic jungle, and how things are being resolved, which is not well understood by anybody above ground. And that notion is primarily a contrast between Tolmekia and Kushana and the valley, and it's driven by a dynamic of scarcity versus abundance. So the valley is powered by wind. It's an ecotone where water meets the earth, supplying an inexhaustible source of power. And Tolmekia and Pijate, the two warring nations, are locked in a battle over scarcity. And the outcome we can see, as Miyazaki likes to talk about, is really the outcome of intense industrialization. The other thing about Nausicaa is that she can, quote unquote, read the wind. She flies using a glider, and has nonviolent means of engaging with even the most dangerous creatures. Everything about her is about harmony, from her understanding of the toxic jungle to her ability to fly, and ultimately her communication with Yomo, which saves her in the end. And oftentimes, I think Miyazaki-san can be read as being somewhat against technology, but I think the truth is what separates us from nature, both writ large and our own human nature, is what he takes aim at. So in Nausicaa, I think he argues most clearly for a harmonious engagement with nature through technology rather than in opposition to it. So if we think about this in terms of AI, the analog for artificial intelligence, I think, is now what's being discussed as alignment. And alignment, simply put, is asking the question: do the goals of humanity and the goals of AI align with each other? I think some major considerations involve conflicting interests, particularly which, like in Nausicaa, value scarcity over abundance. Part of that being AI ties so clearly now to the stock market, to capital, to increasing industrialization and consumption, particularly around things like electricity and power. And as I'll talk about in a moment, also competition. So harmony with AI is not only about intellectual alignment, but also, like the world of Nausicaa, also about cultural, social, and environmental alignment. I think things that we need to be very mindful of. The second consideration really is about ethics. And we have two competing views in the film. For Nausicaa, it is more important to do what's right than to achieve the right outcome. And we're not even really sure what's changed by the end of the film. And Miyazaki talks about this. There's really nothing resolved. Um, but Kushana, on the other hand, who's been colonized by the machinery herself, really only cares about outcomes and consequences. So it's a kind of pitting in philosophical terms of deontology, doing the right thing, versus consequentialism, measuring things as the means justify the ends. So both of them want the same thing, to save their people, but they're going about it in radically different ways. And even the resurrection at the end of the film, Miyazaki talks about as dismissing that as a sacrifice. It's not Nausicaa giving up herself to save everyone else. He says it's about her being so attuned to the pain and suffering of the Omu that she can't stand the idea of living in a world where those things are permitted. So she sacrifices herself in order to make sure that it's the world that she believes in rather than one that has some sort of outcome that she wouldn't believe in. And I think if we think about this in terms of AI, we need to think about the following. We often talk about AI in terms of learning, but what we see right now is not learning per se, but a feedback loop of training with massive amounts of data, with massive amounts of transformers, with billions of parameters constantly being adjusted, and then optimization. And in that sense of optimization is precisely driven by the kind of logic that Kushana follows. It's entirely dependent on outcomes, as is the AI industry. So we need to ask what it would mean to optimize AI for doing what is right rather than doing what achieves the desired outcome. And OpenAI has had some really interesting revelations lately about why it is that large language models hallucinate. And a lot of it has to do with their training and optimization toward pleasing the end user and being able to say things with authority, which are in fact wrong. Um, we all know the end game of every technology these days is our attention. The longer that AI can keep us attentive, the more value it has. So an AI that says, I don't know, is probably not as marketable one as one that tells you exactly what it thinks, even if it's wrong. So we've optimized for certain things, but those things are consequences and outcomes, not process. And we can really think of Nausicaa as process and Kashana as outcomes. Um, Underwritten in the whole film, and I think it's sort of a meditation on this, is the question of fear. Um, Fear is what leads to bad decisions. And there's a beautiful scene when we first meet Nausicaa where we get some insight into her nature. She's given a pet fox squirrel named Tato, and it bites her. And she doesn't react, but instead tells the fox squirrel, don't be afraid. It calms down and actually becomes affectionate and even licks her wounds afterwards. Later, that action is also mirrored by a fight scene where Lord Yupa stops Nausicaa from committing violence in an act of revenge for her father being killed. She goes to strike them with the sword. Lord Yupa stops her, and the blade cuts into him in the process in a very similar way, but it stops her from going down the path of violence and revenge. And it's fear, I would argue, in Kashana's case and earlier, which is precisely what leads to the destruction of the world. So, as we start to speculate around questions of artificial general intelligence and the possibility of superintelligence, and especially the 2027 report, the most frequently cited scenario is for pushing us into the future with an AI race between the US and China. How that happens is, of course, speculative, but the race seems to value outcomes over values. Getting there first is the priority, which means we not only lose control over development as AI begins to create higher levels of AI, but we lose understanding of how the AI itself is developing. Like Nausicaa, we are left with tools we don't fully understand, while feeling forced to use them as a matter of survival. One of the deepest messages Miyazaki offers is that harmony and understanding are the path to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Fourth, we have empathy and understanding. Again, Nausicaa's act of sacrifice is not utilitarian. She's not doing it to save her people. She's doing it because she can't tolerate a world in which such things are allowed to happen. We find at the end she can communicate with the Omo, and in the manga, she can communicate a lot more with animals. Not as humans do with each other, but through an act of compassion, which is what turns the anger of the Omo into a kind of understanding. The failure of Kashana and others is a lack of understanding. They all see the Omu and nature itself as something that is toxic, dangerous, and needs to be wiped out. And without the deeper understanding of the toxic jungle role in cleansing the earth, there's not a way to survive. So if we start to reflect on this around AI, we can begin the process of questioning what exactly alignment means. How do we embed values like understanding, empathy, and compassion into code? Is such a thing even possible? Or to ask it differently, what does it mean to optimize for compassion? So I would argue it begins with an understanding of the harmony and perhaps giving up the overly technological in favor of the human. It is worth thinking about the ways that AI from the very beginning has been built on a premise of deception. In the 1950s, Alan Turing designed a test to see if a machine could trick a human into believing it was a thinking being. He called it the imitation game, and later renamed it the Turing test. And this has been the North Star of AI development ever since. It is fundamentally rooted in a sense of deception. But that is fundamentally incompatible with notions of empathy, compassion, and above all else, understanding. If Nausicaa teaches us anything, it's that without understanding, we're doomed to repeat the failures of the past, perhaps catastrophically. So, where does this leave us? A bit like Nausicaa at the end of the film, we don't really know where we are or what's coming. We're stuck with the technology we have, and just as the toxic jungle will continue to exist and do its work, so will development in AI. But what we do have right now is the opportunity to understand and to rethink development with a different set of values. If we optimize for things like empathy, compassion, and understanding rather than outcomes and deception, we may find a future where our connection to AI leads us to harmony rather than conflict, and abundance rather than the battle over scarcity. One of the quotes that I've been stuck with for a while comes from Tristan Harris, who works at the Center for Humane Technology. And he says the question isn't really what things look like when artificial intelligence overcomes human ability. It's what happens when artificial intelligence overcomes human weakness. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that perhaps we've reached that point. So now is the time for us to start thinking about what it is we want to optimize for in the future, and whether we want it to be a path of competition and conflict, or whether we want it to be a path of harmony, empathy, and understanding. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to discuss or take any questions that people might have.
Well, Douglas, what a phenomenal presentation, first of all. And,
Thank you.
it is so compelling, when I look at this very powerful exploration of Nausicaa and the mirror of, back then it was really about nuclear annihilation. And this is such a mirror to the moment we're facing right now with AI. We're standing at one of the biggest inflection points that humanity's ever experienced from most accounts, what most people are talking about lately. And so I really love that, you're kind of bringing a very powerful story, that is helping us really look at, the story of fear, empathy, and compassion, and how that can help shape, the way that we engage with technology today. And so, one of the questions that I have, and I wholeheartedly, ask, everyone that's here, please send, any of your questions. But, for you, Douglas, kind of thinking about, this powerful story and where we are in the world today, what is the one perspective, or what's the one practice that you'd want the current, I won't just say AI researchers, but really the AGI researchers, right? I was very, fortunate. I work with a number of, AI scientists that are advancing kind of that next stage of, artificial general intelligence, including some of the big pioneers of cognitive AI architectures. And I was very fortunate recently, to meet with, a number of these scientists that have been part of a society, the longest running AGI society, in the world, and they're presenting their latest research, including Rich Sutton, our recent Turing Award winner. And I will say this, coming away from a meeting where you don't have, it's not all of what we're hearing, in the world with media and all of that. It's just the researchers saying, this is what I'm working on. I came away this year really, really seeing the humanity of many of these researchers, or most are pretty deeply conscious. They're very conscious people that they are also working with. And the mindfulness of the impact that these very powerful technologies and research has or can have on our planet and humanity. And what is the practice that you would want really thinking of Nausicaa, what you would want, the AI researchers, policymakers, and the actual entrepreneurs, because that's what most people are seeing, the
Yeah.
entrepreneurs to carry from them with this very powerful example that you've just given.
I mean, I think we're stuck between a rock and a hard place because I think the simple answer is we need to do a better job of enacting policy and regulation that is attuned to the kind of social things that we're seeing. People talk about dating and marrying AI, but we also see recently MIT reporting, people committing suicide after engaging with AI, social conditions, but also just the influence of capitalism and the rush to have the next thing to make the most money without regard to particularly things like the environmental impact. There's so little discussion, I think, of the massive amount of power that's being used to generate even the simplest of queries and how
Mm,
important it is for us to be thinking about those kind of things. So there's that side of it. There's regulation and policy I think can be put in place for us to be much more mindful of the process.
mm,
The flip side of it is if we are in the arms race that everyone seems to think we're in, what does it mean for China to win? What does a world look like where AI is collaborative between the US and China versus who gets there first? And that doesn't even seem to be on the table. And I think that's right. That's the lesson of Nausicaa is that you end up with Tomeki and Pijate. You get, utter destruction and near genocide um, because of the mindset of scarcity. And does it have to be that way? I don't know. Unlike the nuclear bomb, where we're talking about a world war, we're not in that moment. Maybe we are in terms of trade war or something. I let the economists debate that. But, I think that there's a geopolitical question that's above my pay grade, unfortunately. But I think that that's something we need to take seriously. If we let this become a race between us and China, I don't think it ends up going anywhere.
You know, very, very thoughtful and powerful discussion right now. You know, I know a lot of futurists, and get to work with some amazing futurists that really, really think about abundance. Some of the questions that we're bringing up have been brought up in the past with the nuclear war, arms race and so many things. And not that my opinion, matters one iota. But I
Right?
will
I
say
feel so bad.
that
I'm just a guy,
I,
right?
I will say, well, Douglas, I think I do I think it's important for us to have these conversations. And coming from Stephen's perspective, earlier before your talk, if we just reach 3.5% of people get more involved, right? We all have a very powerful voice. And so I think if more and more of us get involved and are saying, well, that's not what I want. This is what I want. And that I will say with market forces, usually if enough of us are saying this isn't what we want, this is our world. And one of
Yeah,
the
that's
things
a
we
hopeful
see,
number, isn't it? 3.5%. It doesn't sound like that much.
yeah, it's doable. It's achievable. So thank you for this incredible perspective and
Well, my
and
pleasure.
also
Thank you for
just
having me.
phenomenal storytelling. Thank you, Douglas.